Hi everyone, my name is Nigel Andrew. I'm currently the chair of the Holsworth Wildlife Research Endowment Committee that's run through the ESA. And today I thought I'd take you through some of the key aspects of writing an application, particularly for new applicants. So I'm just going to go through some key tips here as well, and to identify what you should be looking out for when you're applying for the grant. So first things first, before you start, make sure you read the guidelines. Have a look at the website because all the information you need is there. If you're in any doubt, read the guidelines. Also, before you start filling in the application, make sure you look at the form on the website. It is a web-based form, but there are also some PDFs that you need to include in it as well. So it's good to have an idea of what you need to include and where it needs to go before you start filling in the application itself. And like all good things, prepare early. Don't leave it till the last week to get into it. Give yourself a few weeks, ideally a month, to get going with the application. So this is what the website looks like. It's basically, it's in the ESA's sort of web portal area, and it goes through some of the key things to look at. So the guidelines are there, and it's all web-based, so it should be easy to navigate once you've found it. One of the key things to keep in mind when you are writing your grants is to know what the philosophy behind the grants are. So there's three key aspects to the Holsworth grants, and you should fall under either one or multiple of these philosophies. And these are the things you should be writing to or thinking about when you are writing your grant. So firstly, you need to be doing fieldwork on Australian native plants or animals to gain an understanding of the ecological interactions, population dynamics, animal behaviour and species distribution. The second philosophy is conservation biology and biodiversity studies relating to the management of protected areas and rare or threatened species in Australia. And thirdly, wildlife management relating to sport hunting, harvesting, pest control management of non-game animals and effective land management on native species. So these are things that you should have in mind when you are writing your grant up and actually identifying key things that you want to budget for. And again, I can't say it enough, read the guidelines that are available to you. Be prepared early and giving yourself enough time to draft and revise. Don't submit your first draft. Make sure it's been read, ideally by a colleague, someone that you can trust, someone who can have a look at one of the earlier drafts and make sure it makes sense and make sure that you are putting together a convincing argument. And also make sure your supervisor reads it. Your supervisor needs to know you're submitting one of these through the university, and they should be assisting you developing these grants, or a senior research mentor. These are really important people to have on board when you're putting together any sort of grant, but particularly one of these grants for the Holsworth grants. For many of you, it might be the first grant you've applied for. So it's really important to get feedback as you're going through the process. And again, make sure you focus on one of those key aspects or the philosophy of the Holsworth grant when you are drafting your application. The application is a web submission, as I said before, but there are 3 documents you need to upload to it. So the templates are provided on the website. So they're the project details template, the budget template, and also submission and approval and certification that needs to be filled in by your research office when you submit. So this is what the application, the submission website looks like. So it's up the top, tells you what you're doing, and also it says, again, here, make sure you read the application guidelines. Can I say it again? Read the application guidelines. And also make sure you download the templates here. They're in Word, and the project details and submission application forms are Word documents, and the budget template is an Excel spreadsheet. And when it says surname, first name, when you go to save these and upload them, make sure you include your surname where it says surname and your first name. So for example, if I submitted one, it would be Andrew_Nigel Holsworth project details. It's really important to change those to make them relevant to your own application. The application itself, again, is an online form. So most of this is you just fill in the information as you go through. So again, it's good to look at this before you submit, just so you know what you're getting yourself in for. It doesn't, once you've got all your PDFs and all your information together, it shouldn't take a long time. There might be some information about phone numbers of the research office that you need to also get in prior, but make sure all of it is fairly straightforward in terms of the submission process. Again, make sure, so up here where it says surname, first name, make sure you do save as your surname and save as your first name, just so when it comes to being assessed, instead of the assessors seeing 10 documents with the same generic name, they know who they're assessing. So in terms of the application itself, particularly with the project, make sure you firstly, when you open up the Word document, you put in the year and the round, because sometimes if people have previously applied and they've missed out, you can reapply again. But you've got to make sure that the specific year and round is identified first case, just to make sure we're not doubling up on applications. The project summary it's called an executive summary. It's a repeat of the executive summary used on the online form, but it's obviously easier to work in a Word document where you can format a bit more and then just cut and paste into the online form. Make sure that it's 300 words maximum, so there is a maximum word count here, and things to include background, simple background, get into it really quickly. Why is your research important? Why is it interesting? If you just say it hasn't been studied before, there's not been studied before, it's not a strong reason. What are your questions? What are you trying to answer? This is also for your overall PhD, but also specifically for your Holsworth grant and specifically for the year you're being funded for. We understand that your PhD project is probably bigger than what you're asking for the Holsworth, so make it clear how the Holsworth grant fits into your PhD project. What's the methodology? What specific approaches or models we'll be using, particularly for the year you're applying for funding? And also, what are the outcomes for the year of funding? What will you achieve in that year once you've done your fieldwork and the collections you make, if you are successful in getting funding? And what are you expected to achieve in the year you're funded? This is very different to what you want to achieve from your entire PhD. So make it explicit about what you're achieving over the 12-month period that you're asking for the funds. And also what your anticipated outcomes for your PhD are. So that's going back to the broad area. So again, you only got 300 words here, so you have to be very succinct and very specific in what you're wanting to put forward as your argument for your summary. For your background, 1 page max. Again, keep to the limits. You are provided a template, so use that template and make sure your information fits within it. And you're writing here to ecologists, so people who should know what you're talking about, but they're not experts in your field. So make sure you do use, you can use technical language, but make sure explain it. If you're using jargon, people might not understand it, and then you might not be getting your point across. So keep the language to a knowledgeable audience, but not a discipline-specific audience. So put your research into context. Again, for someone who's not an expert in your field of research, keep the background relevant to the area of research. You don't have to go too broad. If you're doing climate change research, you don't have to go trying to tell people how important it is to understand the threats of climate change or the threats of sort of land degradation. Be very explicit and get to the point relatively quickly. Identify the key research findings up to this point and also the key gaps in your research field. And specifically, what is your key aim? What are your questions and what are your hypotheses for your PhD? And also identify why the methods you're using are appropriate here. You know, have they been used previously, or are they novel? And if they're novel, how do you know they're going to work? And also write in paragraph form. Don't write in dot points. We want to make sure you can string a sentence together and you can put a coherent argument together. And this is best done using paragraphs. The description can take up 3 pages. So this is where the bulk of the information will be. So what are you doing for your PhD? Again, key questions or expectations here, more broad methodologies. And also then, what are you doing in the year that you're asking for funds? What are your key questions and specific methodologies here? So again, a bit of this is an overlap from the questions you identify in the background, but it's putting them into the context of your methods. Include a timeline in here, when things are going to happen, and also this is potentially looking at over the 3 years of potential funding here. In terms of your budget, these budgets should relate back to your questions and to your timeline as well. So here you've got the 3 years identified. As new applicants, you'll be, the key one obviously is the requested funding year, but you're also asked to put in predicted funds for year 2 and year 3. And they're under different titles here. So you've got travel. We've specifically identified international conferences, which are only available in year 3. For this, you're allowed a maximum of $2,000 in the 3rd year. For Australian conferences, you can ask for up to $500 per year. Then there are also travel here might be travel to field sites, field research costs, if there's any, if there's costs specifically for doing research at field. Also lab research costs. Now this is based on costs explicitly related to your fieldwork. Okay, the Holsworth grant is primarily there to assist in helping field research. So any lab research costs need to be related to data you've collected doing fieldwork. If there's any equipment you need, or maintenance of that equipment over time, and also if you need to sort of employ personnel, like if you need to get a field assistant or an intern to help you out in the field, also identified here. For the budget, make sure that each item requested is relevant and it feeds back to your question and to your methodology. Vehicle costs, again, everything in your budget needs to be explicit. Don't round up to make it just fit. If you say, oh, Holsworth gives out $7,500 a year maximum, don't just round the budget to fit that. Make sure you ask for explicit values. So if you say travel, don't just put in $4,000 and say nothing about it. Explicitly say where you're going, how many kilometres that is, how many trips you'll do in the year, and also the costs of, for example, hiring a 4-wheel drive through the institution. These things make it clear that you've put a bit of effort into thinking about how much it's going to cost, and it's budgeted appropriately. These costs may change over time, we understand that, but you should be putting a budget together based on the costs at the time of submission. Again, similar with conferences, don't just say you're going to go to a domestic conference and it's going to cost a lot. Remember, you need to, you also need to, if you just say you're going to go to a domestic conference and you're asking for $2,000, you won't get it from Holsworth because the maximum you can ask for per year is $500. But obviously going to a conference costs more than that. So you should also identify where the extra funds will come from. And also, if you're after $2,000, what is that going towards? Is it going towards the registration costs, the accommodation costs, or the flight, or the travel costs to that particular conference venue? International conferences, again, only if it can be requested in the final year. You need to be explicit where you think you're going to go. Again, you don't know where you're going to go, but be explicit. And also, if you don't know exactly where it is, you just put 2BA and get some general costs about where you're going. And also include here, potential registration costs based on the current year, and also flight and accommodation costs, just to give an idea about the overall sort of, if it's a costly or cheaper conference to go to. In terms of budgeting, when you are asking for equipment, make sure you are asking for equipment that is specific to your project. Don't ask for a bit of equipment that might be really useful for your lab, so 4 or 5 individuals can use in your lab. That's unacceptable. That should be equipment that your university or your supervisor should provide for you. It should be equipment that is specific to your project and you will use for the entirety throughout the project's lifetime. Make sure when you're doing your budget, you save it as a PDF. The key thing here is when you do save it, you can save with narrow margins, and ideally we'll make it 1-page width so we can see all the items and when you request them through the year. If you just save your Excel spreadsheet as is, the budget width goes over 2 pages and it's really difficult to follow through. So one of the things when you do save it as a PDF, go to the checkbox that says 1-page width and save it like that. Make sure you do add other sources that of funding you'll be getting. That obviously, the university should be giving you funding for the work you do. Make sure you know how much that is and what you can spend it on. Also, if you've got industry funding or if your supervisor has a grant like an ARC Discovery or DECRA, is there part of that funding that goes into your project? We want to make sure that the money you request is relevant to the other money available to you. So please make that clear. Fieldwork costs are a priority for the Holsworth Fund to give funding towards. So if you have lab-based costs and field-based costs, the Holsworth has a priority to fund fieldwork. So make sure you take that into account when you're doing your budget. The lab costs and kits that you might need to use, you can put those into your budget, but make sure they have a direct relationship to the data you have collected previously, from a previous year or from a previous field trip. So this is an example of a budget. So again, what we've got here is what you're asking for, year 1, year 2 and year 3, again, all on 1 page, and identifying in each line what you want. So travel, there's field trips. So we say here, we know exactly how many kilometres, how many trips and what costs it is per kilometre. And we've identified that. That request is appropriate for Holsworth. For international conferences, you can see they're blank in year 1 and year 2, but in year 3, there's $2,000 asked for from the Holsworth, and there's an extra amount from other grant funds. And this is because it obviously costs more than $2,000 to get to the international conference. This one would be getting over $5,000, and that's the normal cost for international travel if we're able to do it. And then the cost for society, so the Ecological Society of Australia, $500 is given out by the Holsworth, but you still have to put into account here what the registration costs will be. If they're not known for this year, look at last year's amount and you can use that as a guide. But also airfares, get a quote, just get an online quote for airfares and accommodation costs. That again shows you how much it is and make it explicit. $500 max from Holsworth and the rest made up from either potentially your university or other sources. Fieldwork research costs, for example, you might need to buy kit. So you put them in here, what it is you're buying, how many they are and how much they cost each. If you're doing lab costs, if you need a DNA kit, make sure you identify what you need, how many of the kits you need and how much they cost per kit and put the total into the budget. You might find a whole range of different specimen jars or other aspects of equipment that you might need for your fieldwork is fine. And if you need to employ someone, if you need field assistance, even though you might not be asking Holsworth for this, it is still important to actually identify it in the cost of the budget, because this, again, it shows you've been thinking about it. It's, if your university requests you need someone to help in the field, or if you need help yourself, you don't want to go in the field with yourself, make sure you budget for it because it's important to identify. The other thing that's important to do is also get confirmation from your research office that you can submit this through them. And so this usually can take a week or two. So make sure you do find out who in the research office you need to contact, and make sure that they sign this and send it back to you. And this is put up as a PDF in the online form. It's really important to do this because the contract that, if you are successful with your Holsworth grant, the contract of funding is between ESA and the university. The money doesn't go directly to you, okay? So it effectively comes out as a contract, so that the research office needs to know that there might be money coming to them. And this also makes sure that what you're putting forward is officially allowed by the university. One other thing you need to submit is your academic record. Now, it's like an academic CV, but specifically to highlight your research expertise, but also what you've done throughout your time as an undergrad, but also in your honours or master's degrees. So you're selling your skill set. You're not just giving a transcript of, if you got a credit or distinction in your second and third year, or you might have just passed Maths 101 and Chemistry 104 in first year. That's not what it's about. It's actually to highlight your main achievements and your skill sets, to really identify your abilities as an emerging researcher. And from this also includes statements on your research philosophy. It's to really sell yourself as a researcher and to enable the assessors to get a feeling for you as a researcher, where you're heading, what trajectory you've been on, and where you're going to. Also, if you've had a research history, if it's been paid or unpaid, and also identify the skills you've learned in sort of your third year or fourth year as an undergrad, but also your honours and masters that you still use and are relevant to the Holsworth project that you're proposing. They're really important things to put into your academic record here, and don't just see it as a sort of a transcript, because that doesn't do well in terms of highlighting your expertise. So generally, at the moment, 30 to 50% of grants are getting funded through the Holsworth. So it is a competitive grant system. If you are not successful in one round, you can reapply for the next round. So don't feel like you missed out completely. We generally don't give feedback because we have so many people applying for these, but it can be really useful to reassess your application and also look at the guidelines for the examiners. I'll be doing a sort of talk about for the examiners on this, so it can be really useful to actually listen to that as well, to find out what we're asking examiners to look for. Usually, at the moment, the 80 to 90% of the funds are given. So even if you ask for $7,500, in many cases you won't actually get that, because we are constrained by the amount of funds that are available through the Holsworth Endowment. But we're also trying to support as many students as we can and give them a substantive amount. So that changes, but it's also be aware of that you don't necessarily get all the money you have asked for. The assessments are done by ecologists. They're people who are currently active in the field, but then won't necessarily be the specialists in your discipline area. So make sure you do write to a broad audience. They can also include supervisors of previous award winners, but also previous award winners themselves. So that's to take into account. You get people at a whole range of different stages throughout their research careers. They can be in academia, but they also can be in private practice, in consultancy, or also working in other agencies. But they're still keen to help out to provide sort of assistance with the Holsworth grant. And the other thing to be aware of is, even if you do find out you're successful with your grant, don't go and spend the money before the contract is actually signed between SA and the university. The contract isn't with you, and it is with the university. So the university needs to be happy to take the money, and also ESA needs to give them the money before it's available. So just be really careful about, if you're successful, that's wonderful, but you do need to be aware that there is still a contract that needs to be signed that is yeah, independent of you. So just be really aware of that. And as I say before, good luck with your applications. It is, you know, it is competitive, but it's also a really good experience to apply for grants throughout your PhD. And I wish you all your best in your applications and also with your PhD research. Bye now.